There's a bit of background noise, so we'll have
Hold
to see
on,
how it
adjusting
goes.
mic, adjusting mic. How's this?
Yeah, perfect. Cool.
Excellent.
So today I'm talking to Juni Young, a Guqin teacher based in Canada and founder of the Toronto Guqin Society. Now, over the past few years, there has been a growing interest in the Guqin as an instrument, and also in Chinese musicology more in general on the part of Western scholars and of the West. In 2000, the New York Qin Society was founded by Yuan Yongping,
Yongping, yes.
and obviously the Toronto Guqin Society, founded in 2005 by yourself. And many others have been popping up all over America over the last few years. So I was wondering if you might talk a bit about that, this resurgence in interest and your experience of it. And maybe then from there we can also get into Chinese musicology and the history of the Guqin more in general.
So yeah, earlier on you were asking about my thesis about the Hanfu movement. And unlike other people who rationalize that it's the rise of Chinese nationalism and so forth, I go like, no, it's all because of money. Money explains everything. The same thing goes true for the Guqin as well. In 2003, the United Nations UNESCO decided to declare the Guqin, as well as culture, as an oral and intangible cultural heritage. And in China, they were taking this very seriously, and the government poured in money for all kinds of publicity as well as grants and funds in order to promote the art. And as a result, more and more people grew interested in the instrument, and the makers and teachers also were enthusiastic about promoting the arts. And so, hence, now we have this interesting phenomenon where it's all the young people finding this to be the new hip thing. And then as they grow older, they're pushing their children into learning this culture as well. So that's basically how it is. As for overseas, it partly has to do with the internet. The fact that with the free flow of information almost instantaneously, we get more and more knowledge and material coming in from China. It becomes easier for people to import the idea as well as the material overseas and then spread it over. And within the past 10 years, we're seeing more and more Chinese immigrate to Western countries, and with their capital, they're opening up the posh Guqin salons in the Western cities as well. In Toronto, for example, I know that some tea shop also started a Guqin salon in a historical old town just outside of Toronto.
So there's also an element of cultural fashion to it as well.
Indeed, it is a fashion. And as for myself, I would say that it would be impossible for me to get started on the Guqin without this boost. It would have been a lot cheaper to buy the instrument before the craze, as the demand and the price was lower. And with speculation and new money going in, everything starts to go crazy on the price. So the prices in Chinese dollars has been going up. Meanwhile, the Chinese currency is getting stronger and stronger. Of course, we know that this is unhealthy hyperinflation, but still, well, a lot of old scholar players would criticize this as just flat-out greed. But at the same time, it also proves that the Guqin culture is, for better or worse, integrating with modern society, in the
Yes.
sense that it's becoming a capitalistic culture.
Well, I mean, as obvious of a point as it is to make, I can say for my part that if it wasn't for the greater availability of information and things like the internet, that not only would I not necessarily have access to many of the resources that allow me to do the videos I do, but I think even more importantly, I wouldn't ever have been able to get in touch with many of the people who've been crucial in pointing me in the right direction for my research. I mean, we wouldn't be having this conversation now if it wasn't for that.
I should probably tell you how I got to learn about the Guqin.
Yes.
When I was little, I was given a CD back in the days of like Windows 3.1 on various things in China. And I got to listen to Guqin music from that CD in the early 90s. And then came around early 2000s when the internet just came around. I actually learned about basic Guqin knowledge through the earliest website and email list of the North American Guqin Association based in San Francisco. So that's Wang Fei's society.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked my parents to somehow get me an instrument, and through some friends of friends, they did from Guangzhou. And they also got me this VCD, which was this newfangled media, in teaching how to learn the instruments through a series of videos. And it was a problem then. I speak at the time English and Cantonese. Mm-hmm. To me, Mandarin was a totally different language. I could barely understand what the teacher was teaching. So I had to go back online and search textual sources, but thankfully more and more were popping up. So I actually barely managed to scrounge together enough information to get me off started. But eventually, another good thing about early internet is that it's unregulated.
Yes.
And people were generous enough to scan the entire 情绪继承, which is an academic work, at that time around 17 volumes and incomplete, which was a collection of all existing known historical sources and manuscripts on the instruments. Basically, I was struggling just trying to understand the material that I discovered. But thankfully, the textual sources were much clearer than all the other forms of sources, audio or visual, and picking it up was relatively simple. Thankfully, we have CDs and audio recordings and such nowadays that it's easier to imitate other people, especially masters.
Yeah.
Yes. The rhythm, because in Guqin manuscript, you do not have records of time value or pitch. Mm-hmm. So unless you got your tuning of the instrument absolutely correct, who knows? You could be playing the wrong beat or you could be playing the wrong tone altogether. Mm-hmm. So learning the style is one thing. Learning how to interpret is the other thing. Because there is no time value recorded on the manuscript, you're open to interpret phrasing and such in a rather liberal manner. So there are better ways of doing things than others, but there is no absolutely dictated way in which how a certain musical phrase needs to be parsed and played. And having grown up in the West, I suppose I am lucky that I come from this in a critical perspective, and I'm able to see multiple sides of this. So I continue to teach my students to keep an open mind and be ready to play the same piece in 3 different styles whenever you feel like it and when the situation calls for it.
Yeah, so I know that in the past, traditional Guqin notation didn't give tempo indications, like you were saying, which on the one hand, I guess makes it a bit harder to interpret some older musical sources, but also it gives more freedom to the musician when interpreting the piece. But in more recent times, Guqin transcriptions have started using a system of beams and dots, which I guess is borrowed from sort of Western rhythmical notation, to indicate the tempo, and that they overlay this over the traditional notation. Now, do you think that in some ways maybe this changes or maybe restricts the interpretive freedom of the players today?
This is up to the interpretation of the student and the master. Basically, that means how much they treat this recorded interpretation of rhythm and pitch as, well, internalizing it as dogma.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, Chinese students learn in their schools by, drills
Yes.
and forced repetition. And if you learn in so-called large classes in the Chinese chin salons today, basically the same method applies. One teacher plays, and massive amounts of students follow suit. And their goal is to have the students play in the exact same style as the master. Some masters in the past also do this, but as we always like to cite, Master Wu Jingyue from Beijing in the mid-20th century once taught a student his favorite piece, the dialogue between the fisherman and the woodcutter. And after he finished playing one style and the student just barely managed to grasp his tempo and rhythm, when they started playing together, Master Wu suddenly started playing in a completely different way. So the student goes like, "Why the heck did you change the style altogether?" And Master Wu goes like, "It wouldn't be fun otherwise."
I guess as with most traditional disciplines, the student-teacher interaction is the key.
Indeed.
And speaking as someone who has studied and teaches the Guqin, I mean, would you say that there are any aspects of the ideas, the context, the culture of the Guqin that are either difficult to teach in English or to translate into another language in general?
If you ask a lot of Guqin players, they would tend to tell you that the aesthetic ideas within it are difficult to express in English, and I call BS on that. I believe that if you introduce the concept in the book, introduce the name of it, and then the idea how it's developed, I don't believe that anything can not be expressed in any given language. It just needs to be taught in the right context. And that is one of the problems that we have in early 21st century, is that there's no good way of introducing a said tradition because we don't have the resources for them yet. And that's partially the reason why I wrote Standards of the Guqin. It's that there are books on the Guqin, for example, with Hans van Hulick's book coming out as early as the 1960s. But the problem with that was that it was a scholarly art text, and it described more about the culture surrounding the instrument rather than the practical how-to of learning the instrument. So the result of books like that is that there's a lot of commentary and discussion on the instrument without actually knowing what it is and actually getting a hands-on feel for it. And that's a general problem you see with Chinese arts, not just with specific instruments.
Yeah, and especially I think when it comes to something like music. I think that to a certain extent you have to engage in the practice of music itself to understand it the way that a performer or a musician does. So do you think that there's maybe some ways of bridging that for people who are non-musicians who are learning about music, or people who are just starting out learning an instrument?
The way that I wrote my book is actually heavily based in a new historical approach. When I say new, it's not really that new. It came out in the 1980s. And in the field of Chinese studies, it's called the China-centered approach. Before that, Chinese history taught in the West is often taught in a very Western-centric kind of approach. Before that, if you study Chinese history, you would learn about John King Fairbank and Jonathan Spence, about the impact and response kind of approach. So, for example, the West has opened up China with guns and germs and steel, and forcing them to have trade, and therefore China modernized. And a historian by the name of David Cohen wrote a book on the Boxer Rebellion in the 1980s, saying that when the Chinese responded with all kinds of voodoo magic and stuff, and poured dog's blood all over the Western-built railroads, he doesn't see it as a kind of like backward voodoo versus modern technology kind of conflict, but he puts it that if you look at it from the Chinese eyes, it's seen as a war on magic.
Yes.
And that the tools of the West, railways as well as Christianity, is put on equal grounds with, say, Taoist magic and incantations and stuff. And what he did with that study was that he needs to describe the Chinese context in the Chinese own voice and the way how people understood the world then. So applied to music, what my approach to teaching the Guqin was that because I'm writing a book in English, I needed to write in a way that Anglophone speakers brought up in the schooling system of the West would be familiar with how to understand things. So, for example, you teach something and you make them reflect and think about certain things like, why do I play something this way? Because we're used to thinking about this way because that's how we're taught at school. But at the same time, I introduce Chinese words and concepts, and for example, the way how the Guqin records its music. It uses 简字谱, which is a simplified character system that records left hand, right hand, what position, what movements, what string, and so forth. And it's composed together, not much different from, say, the Korean alphabet system, the Hangul system. And in a way, I'm forcing Western readers to parse Chinese characters, whether they know Chinese or not. If they understand Chinese, power to them. If they don't, they just have to memorize a bunch of symbols and perhaps learn some form of Chinese in the process. So it's a two-way kind of movement coming together. So I'm inferring Chinese language and concepts, but at the same time, I'm using a Western pedagogy.
I mean, I think what you were saying about the need to understand a tradition from its own perspective, I mean, that's very important because it's very easy when approaching another culture, I think, to forget that. Whenever you're viewing a culture or a tradition different from the one that you grew up in, I think there will always be things happening within that culture that you from the outside are not able to see or to understand in the way that they are seen from the inside. And so often it can be quite easy to be dismissive of the worldview of another culture or the ideas of a culture in the past, or even your own culture in the past. Because as cultures develop and change, certain things can become obscure. Knowing some things can mean that it's harder to know other things, or certain kinds of knowledge can obscure other kinds of knowledge. I mean, that's why people sometimes close their eyes when they listen to music, because one stream of information coming in through the eyes obscures the other. And as cultures develop over time in certain ways, they change and they open up new possibilities, but they also close off other paths, and they're no longer able to see things quite the way they once did.
And new biases form. Daniel,
exactly.
Did you know that the stereotype of Chinese music being pentatonic only came about after the Opium War?
Yes.
Again, citing my friend Dr. Tse, he would say that before the Opium War, which the first one in 1839 to 1840, Chinese music had a lot of heptatonism, and a lot of that largely Pythagorean, but occasionally inferring just tones kind of system. But after that, there was a huge backlash of conservatism, and Qin scholars, much so Confucian scholars as well, thought that the Qing Empire was in decline because traditional morality was breaking down. And since music is so intricately tied with morality, they decided to start censoring all the heptatonism.
Yeah.
And they started changing all the books, finding all the non-pentatonic tones, and then changing them to pentatonism. That's why all the received, passed down pieces that we get from the traditional lineages tend to be very pentatonic. But then when we rediscover the Ming received manuscripts of the same pieces, we find a lot of heptatonic notes stuffed into them. It doesn't help when knowledge production in modern China is, at least in academic institutions and conservatories, still largely dictated by the Marxist historical model. If you read a lot of books about Chinese musicology, which I see as a subdiscipline of anthropology, keep in mind that Chinese institutions during Mao's era was cut off from the rest of the world. So anthropology in China has stayed pretty much like the 1920s and before kind of anthropology, the measuring human skulls kind of thing. So when the Chinese anthropological world opened up to American scholarship in the 1980s, they were in for quite a shock because the West had developed away from that for quite some time. And I think that Chinese scholarship still has a ways to catch up with this. So if you read Chinese musical works, you see that much of their writing is still very on a survey level, and they basically take note of what kinds of music is there across the different recognized ethnicities of within Chinese borders, and then they say what kind of stuff there are, emphasizing particularly the folk tradition because the Communist Party doesn't want to emphasize the elite tradition, and if they do want to write about the elite tradition, they usually put it in a historical context.
I guess in a way that's almost an inversion. That in the past, in ancient times, the academics, the Shi, emphasized the elite tradition in their writings and essentially ignored the parallel folk tradition. And then during the 20th century, the Cultural Revolution brought about an almost complete inversion of this model, I guess.
In a sense, yes. I've been to Shanghai Conservatory a few years ago, and I've actually asked around to the professors, asking, so, say that I'm a student in the conservatory studying Chinese music. What kind of music theory courses do I get? And they actually gave me a blank stare. They say whatever the same thing that Western music theory students get, with a particular side in, say, composition or musical analysis on what they call ethnic music, which stands for Chinese music, basically. Mm-hmm. And their understanding of Chinese music is a set series of specific progressions, pentatonism, and stuff like that. They see Chineseness as tangible elements that can be used. In other words, they are tropes to be used. If you listen to modern Chinese compositions, so-called like minyue or folk Chinese music, you would see that it's very stereotypical.
Yes.
It's very recognizably Chinese, that there are certain elements that clearly define its Chineseness.
Yeah.
Modern compositions for a modern Western orchestra, but it plays in a Chinese style, if you will.
I know, it's so strange. It almost seems like when I listen to, I guess, what you might call contemporary classical Chinese music or orchestral Chinese music that comes out of the conservatoires, it almost sounds like it's Western composers trying to imitate a Chinese style, if that makes sense, rather than the autochthonous tradition. I guess the particular subtleties of many of the historic traditions seem to be largely absent, or maybe they're obscured by more stereotypical elements. And I mean, it's obviously not true in all cases, but it's definitely a trend.
The problem from my angle of seeing things is that the Guqin is an excellent repository of pieces stored from over the times. We could actually quite accurately, dating down to the century, what style or what period a certain piece came from, because we have textual and the score music to go along with it. So we have a pretty idea of this kind of era played a certain style, and that's how they composed in a certain era and stuff like that. But you don't see this kind of narrative really coming into popular narratives of Chinese musical history or theory. When we talk about Chinese music, we usually think of it as one entity, timeless and so forth. And I think this kind of education is rather lacking, whereas in the West, you could say Baroque music, classical music, Gregorian chants.
Yeah.
So I think that the knowledge is already there. The Chinese are excellent in storing and compiling data.
Yeah.
But to organize this as an effective narrative and to disseminate this as a comparative study of like eras of Chinese music versus eras of Western music, it would be really helpful to develop this kind of narrative instead of saying this is Western music, this is Chinese music.
Yeah.
It does injustice to both traditions if we just compare it like this way. Back in 2005 or so, China Postal released a series of stamps comparing the Chinese music with Western music because it was like some commemoration of Chinese-Austrian diplomatic relations. And they compared the Guqin to the piano, the modern grand piano.
Yeah.
And if you really think about the roles, the volume, and the size and its function, it's not really that great of a comparison. Even the word chin has been translated into several different English words, from zither to lute, as Hewlett put it. There's really no good way of comparing it. What is its form, its function, how it's played, and so forth. I personally see it that if they are to compare the guqin with a keyboard instrument, it wouldn't be with a piano. It would be with a clavichord.
Yes.
But the funny thing is, no one in China has a clavichord. Even Shanghai and Central Conservatory combined only have around 3 to 5 harpsichords, but not clavichords.
Yeah. Although, to be honest, I doubt that most people, even in the West, have any idea of what a clavichord is these days.
Right. So there will be a lot of rediscovery on both sides.
Exactly. And I guess that leaving aside the obvious fact that the guqin and the piano are completely different classes of instrument, there's also the historical fact that whereas the guqin has been around for a very long time and I guess is directly intertwined with the history of Chinese music going back a long time. On the other hand, the piano it's a modern instrument, which is instead the result of a specific technological and cultural journey in the West.
Without modern steel technology, the modern grand wouldn't be in existence.
Yes. And also, culturally, the piano would not have the dominance that it does if it had not been for the previous prominence that the harpsichord and the organ had. And the organ became as central as it was because in the Middle Ages it was seen as a good way of teaching Neoplatonic harmonic theory. Otherwise, the organ would probably never have gained access to the church, as the church was initially very opposed to allowing a secular instrument like the organ into its spaces. So there's a huge number of historical contingencies at the end of which the piano was the final result, I guess, whereas the guqin in some form or another has been around for a very, very long time, and it's been tied both to the elite and the more folk traditions. It almost has this connotation of being the philosopher's instrument. I mean, it's almost like a 7-stringed monochord that being so constructed can produce such beautiful melodies. And the fact that it is played largely through the use of harmonics, I guess, shows the way in which it has been a tool for the study and the practice of harmonic theory.
Right, but even these two things that you mentioned, the academic scholar tradition of chin playing in China, as well as the use of harmonics in our performance, is quite a medieval product, if you will. That before that, there was an entirely total image of the chin, where it was strictly the court musician or the artisan, which is a very low kind of social stature, along with the lines of, say, prostitutes and merchants. Yes, merchants are on the bottom of the social scale in Chinese
Yes, it's
society.
because sorry, is it? I seem to remember it's because they don't
They do not
produce any
produce
goods, but
things
only
themselves.
act as middlemen.
Yes,
Yes.
they do not produce. That was the primary reason why they were looked down upon. So this narrative of saying that that the Qin and its performance is a study of history, science, musicology, and that it's all regulated by a Confucian principle, it I see it as basically a hijacking, if you will, of medieval near modern tradition. Because the scholars are the ones who are writing and printing the books. Whereas in the court musician, they still have the court musician tradition, but they don't write the books. We don't get to read about them. But what we do know, if we do read the few books that are written on Confucian ritual, is that we know that court musicians who play the qin in Confucian temples or the imperial court itself, they were actually just given crash courses. They don't really know how to effectively play the instrument aside from how to tune the instrument, playing open strings, and a few basic press positions, namely the 10th and the 9th position, which are the quarter and third lengths of the instrument. So you basically know how to play a string, its perfect fourth and its perfect fifth.
Yeah.
And if you play court music, it's basically in one bar of music, which spans about 8 or 9 seconds. It's very slow. You basically spam 13 to 16 notes of the same pitch. So you get one open string, and then you use a different string on the fifth or fourth to match the thing, and you spam 13 to 16 notes about it. That's it. I wouldn't consider myself to be an expert on it. I'm still learning, but there's
Well, we're all still
plenty to talk
learning.
about. And unfortunately, the sources where this kind of information on the Chinese development of such a history is unfortunately very restricted to Chinese.
Yeah.
And I think that there needs to be a kind of a basic bridge over by just simple translation. Do you know any good works in English that describe the history of the development of Chinese music or musicology? Because I don't.
No, none at all. I mean, I guess to an extent that's an idea that I've been toying around with myself. Some sort of larger history of music, and not just of the West, but also showing parallels between the history of Western music and what China was doing with music at the same time. Because I remember the first time I came across the story of Chu Yu, must be about 9 or 10 years ago now. It was about 18 or 19, something like that. It was a book on the history of the adoption of equal temperament, and it was really just a brief mention about him. It said that he was the first, historically documented person to have developed a mathematical solution to the problem of equal temperament, that he was a prince of the Ming dynasty, and that he was a great mathematician, which for the time, it's not unexpected to see music and mathematics together in this way. And then that was it. It moved on. It didn't really say any more about him. And this was ostensibly a work about the establishment of equal temperament, and I was left wanting to know more. He was a character who was a great scholar, a prince, who had developed what is now the most widespread tuning system in the world, and I couldn't find hardly anything about him anywhere.
It's also unfortunate that he lived at the mid-late Ming dynasty. His theory was never allowed the time or the opportunity to be implemented in practice because everyone was so used to Pythagorean tuning that his works were basically dismissed or just simply seen as too difficult to implement. And then when the Qing dynasty came around, it literally regressed. The Kangxi Emperor and later, subsequently, the Qianlong Emperor, when they had to set the standards of measurements for their new Qing Empire, that they had to dismiss basically the scientific achievements of the Ming. And so we were stuck for 260 some years a system that was actually mathematically incorrect. Kongzi developed a system where he basically solved the Pythagorean comma by stuffing 2 more labels to it, basically giving the comma as 2 more notes. And it was only in the Republican era when musicologists like Yang Liu wrote heavily and scathingly on the criticism of the system, saying it's totally wrong. And as a result, when Chinese music needed to modernize in the Republic, they just adopted Western music systems. Because by then it was equal temperament and it was scientifically advanced.
Yeah, it's ironic that even though it was developed in China, equal temperament essentially had to be re-imported into China from the West during the 20th century because of how successfully it had been suppressed. But the Ming-era China, in which Zhu operated before this closing off of Chinese culture during the Qin, was... I mean, it's a fascinating context because it's a period during the 16th century of great exchange between China and the West. And there were many ideas coming from China to the West that were very influential on the evolution of thought in the West. I'm thinking of people like Spinoza and Leibniz, and on how we think today. And vice versa, China was also being influenced by the empirical, evidence-based approach that was developing in the West. And in many ways, Zhu represents one of the pinnacles of the Chinese side of this context. He was really in favor of this newly flourishing empirical, experimental approach to knowledge. And because of this, he found himself somewhat in opposition to the traditional Confucian narrative, because of how he was embracing this empirical approach to music theory. And Zhu Zaiyu himself is essentially what we in the West would call a Renaissance man. He was a great scholar, a great mathematician, a theoretician of music, of astronomy, of the science of calendars, and so on.
But keep in mind that these studies are basically classified under the same category. If you read any of the Chinese dynastic annals, you'll find that the description of how music is measured is usually placed in the same chapter as astronomy and the calendar, how the calendar is written out and calculated.
And there's another very interesting parallel there, I think, because the same was true in the West as well, all throughout the Middle Ages and up until the Renaissance. As a theoretical endeavor, the study of music was understood to be the study of number in time. So it was studied in the quadrivium, the 4 sciences of number, which were math, geometry, music, and astronomy. And we see something very similar in Chinese history, where the theory of music was studied as a science.
The measurement of frequency, basically.
Yes. And the study of tones and their correct tuning was understood as the study of measurement. The setting of the huangzhong tone and the length of the huangzhong pipe would essentially be a unit of measurement, and the volume within the pipe would be a unit of volume, and the weight of that volume when it was filled with rice or millet seed would be a unit of weight, so that the entire system of measurements was related. And so the study was under the jurisdiction or overseen, I guess, by the government departments that were responsible for weights and measurements or something along those lines.
That's correct. Because understanding huangzhong or setting huangzhong would be like setting the meter stick that you see in Paris. So the traditional Chinese term would be du, liang, heng. Du is measurement. Liang, well, du is length measurement. Liang is volume and weight measurement. Oh, sorry, it's just volume. Heng is weight measurement. So you have basically markings, volume, and the balance.
Yeah, isn't it crazy to think that even though all of these things have had a massive impact on the way that we tune our instruments today, on the kinds of music that we play today, right down to the very notes and structures that are used, and that despite this huge impact, these are often areas of the history of music that are largely overlooked even
It
today.
doesn't help when even the Chinese schools do not really talk about it either. It doesn't help either that most conservatory students tend to avoid theory and history altogether. They went to the conservatory to study music, and their idea of music is performance.
Yeah, I guess I'm weird because to me, the histories and the theories and all the cultures that have formed around music are, for me, one of the most fascinating aspects of music to study.
Yes.
I guess it always seemed to me like learning simply to play music by learning how to read the notes from a score, but without understanding maybe the underlying harmonies or the theories or the culture that it emerged from. It's a bit like reading or like learning to read, but by learning how to read or pronounce individual letters or strings of letters, but without actually knowing the words or the language or having absorbed the culture around it.
Indeed. I underwent the piano curriculum of the Royal Conservatoire of Music of Canada myself. And I hated every moment when I was young learning the piano. You know, the typical mom forced me into it kind of scenario. And my teacher is a student of piano at the Shanghai Conservatory of Music. And the Shanghai Conservatory of Music uses the Russian conservatory system. And they're very focused on performance. So what you get is a very dazzling melange of different technical performance pieces from different eras without giving the context. And I find the process to be very baffling. And faster is better. Is the misconception. And basically it's not a very encouraging environment for the appreciation of the human developments of music. The reason why the Guqin is so popular nowadays and is seen as like the break from typical Chinese music curriculum is because it was, for the last few centuries, a wild child of Chinese music. Until 2006, the Chinese musical system, or the musical curriculum, did not have a conservatoire system for the instrument. And it was only 2006, 3 years after UNESCO declared the instrument to be an oral and intangible cultural heritage, that the Chinese conservatory started putting performance contests, a grade system to the instrument. And then after that, all the parents started forcing their kids to learn the instrument. And a lot of old school players are going like, no, this is not the way to go.
Yeah.
So I'm comparing the results of the students from before the system, or still does not adopt the conservatory system, with those after. And the result is that there's a distinct difference.
Yes.
Those who enjoy the music versus the people who go a rigorous, quantifiable system. And then some people actually blame capitalism as its faults. And you'll see that no matter Chinese or English, often people blame that it's capitalism ruining the good music and the elite or the pure, unadulterated tradition.
Yes, however, I do think that the more traditional approach to the Guqin will continue to live on alongside the more academic culture, the conservatoire model, just as it did in the past.
In some sense, the Guqin tradition is still hanging on with its regional pride. We still see ourselves like in the Kung Fu martial arts world. We boast of the lineages and origins of our teachers. So, for example, I often claim that I studied under Master Zheng Chengwei of the Sichuan Pai School, but in actuality, many of the professional players or expert players today, because of modern communication and transport technology, we've probably studied from multiple masters from multiple schools.
Yeah.
But one thing that remains is that there is a clear differentiation from the pure conservatory bred versus the classical style master play one sentence, you learn one sentence kind of an oral tradition. And that there's a clear distinction between the kinds of knowledges that you acquire from such. Well, regardless, globalization is here and it's here to stay. And narratives or reflections of pedagogy or what constitutes a good knowledge of music, that narrative is going to be increasingly globalized. And I think that my standpoint on how to improve the process of learning music and how to correlate between theory and performance is not a narrative or a product of the current Chinese musical field situation, but how music is understood in general nowadays, how classical music is understood these days.
I guess that's part of also what I'm trying to do with my videos. I think that because there is a certain way that music is understood and that its role is perceived today, that most people imagine that it must have always been so. And so I try to show other ways of understanding and living music. Today, for example, music is seen as something that you study in a conservatoire, perhaps, or anywhere else. But either way, music is understood as being a specialist skill, not as something that just everyone does. And in fact, for me, that was a strange thing to realize, I remember, when I was a child, because growing up around music, and my parents both played, when I was very small, I remember just having this implicit assumption about music, that it was something that everyone did. It's one of those skills that everyone learns to do, like walking, talking, riding a bike, those kinds of things. And then I realized, as I was growing up, that that wasn't the case. But even today, there are still cultures where music is not a specialist skill, where, for example, people will sing as happily as they speak. And there have been many different types of traditions and ways of understanding music, and the ways that people have related their lives to music and the effects that it's had on culture. The traditions of philosopher musicians, contemplative music, shamanistic practices, religious music.
Keep in mind that our requirements or our demands of how we understand knowledge and what we ask out of knowledge differs throughout the time periods. So
exactly.
The questions or the problems that we have listed today are actually very modern issues, where we are now demanding these kinds of knowledges from old information that we have not thought about before.
Yes. And what we consider to be knowledge today is necessarily of a different kind than in the past. And it's defined by the questions that we're asking. In fact, in this way, I think that we really do have more to learn from cultures that either lived in the distant past or lived distantly geographically. And this is just because everyone grows up naturally absorbing the assumptions that underpin the culture they live in. And these define the way that we engage with and experience the world. If you go and ask someone from your own culture, they'll pretty much tell you what you already know. It's only through people who are very distantly removed from us, either in space or in time, that we can truly catch glimpses of a different way of seeing the world.
Hear, hear.
I know, to be honest, actually, I think that's probably quite a good point to stop for today.
Sure.
Unfortunately, my clock is telling me that my time is almost up.
Sure.
But thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you, Daniel.
And hopefully we can do it again sometime soon.
Of course, I'll be happy.